Troy, known as Ilion in ancient Greek, is famed as the setting of the Trojan War, one of history's most legendary conflicts. For millennia, poets and storytellers have recounted how this great city in northwest Anatolia, modern Turkey, was besieged by a coalition of Greek forces. According to Greek myth, the war began with a divine quarrel. The Trojan prince Paris was asked to judge who was the fairest goddess, Hera, Athena, or Aphrodite. Paris awarded the golden apple to Aphrodite, who in return promised him the most beautiful woman in the world. That woman was Helen, queen of Sparta. Smitten, Paris traveled to Sparta and absconded with Helen, whether by abduction or elopement varies by source, taking her back to Troy. Outraged, Helen's husband, King Menelaus, sought help from his brother Agamemnon, the powerful king of Mycenae. Agamemnon raised a huge army from across the Greek world to sail to Troy and recover Helen, setting the stage for war. Once the Greeks landed at Troy, a siege of epic proportions began. The war, as later told by Homer and others, lasted 10 years. The Greeks, also called Achaeans, encamped on the plains outside Troy's formidable walls, while the Trojans, led by King Priam and his sons, such as Hector and Paris, defended their city. The conflict was more than a mere human affair. The Olympian gods took sides, with Athena and Hera supporting the Greeks, vengeful at Paris's judgment, and Aphrodite aiding the Trojans alongside Apollo and Artemis. Many iconic duels and battles occurred during the protracted siege. The greatest Greek warrior, Achilles, clashed with the Trojan champion Hector outside the city's gates. In Homer's Iliad, Achilles' rage at the death of his friend Patroclus leads him to slay Hector in single combat, a duel that has become legendary. Achilles, invulnerable except for his heel according to later myth, seemed unstoppable. However, fate caught up with him too. In later epics, Achilles is said to be killed by Paris's arrow, guided by Apollo, demonstrating that even heroes were not immortal. Other famed warriors took the stage as well: Odysseus, known for his cunning, Ajax for his strength, and Trojan heroes like Aeneas, a kinsman of the royal family who, according to myth, would survive Troy's fall. Throughout these struggles, divine interventions influence outcomes. Athena tricks Trojan warriors, Apollo spreads plague in the Greek camp, and Zeus weighs the fates of men on his scales. The epic portrays the war as a mix of human courage and folly intertwined with capricious gods. After a decade of stalemate, the Greeks devised an ingenious stratagem to finally take Troy. As the traditional tale goes, first fully told in later works like Virgil's Aeneid rather than the Iliad, the Greeks built a giant wooden horse and left it outside Troy's gates, then feigned sailing away in defeat. Despite warnings from cautious Trojans, the city jubilantly dragged the mysterious Trojan horse inside as a trophy. Unbeknownst to them, it was filled with select Greek soldiers. In the dead of night, these hidden Greeks emerged from the horse's belly, opened the city gates, and signaled to their returning comrades. The Greek army poured into Troy, catching the city completely off guard. Troy was sacked in a horrific orgy of destruction. Its men were massacred, and women and children enslaved. King Priam was slain at the altar of Zeus, and flames engulfed the palaces and temples. This fiery doom of Troy marked the end of the war and became an enduring symbol of total defeat in ancient literature. In mythic accounts, a few Trojans did escape the carnage. Most famous is Aeneas, a cousin of Hector, who according to later Roman legend fled burning Troy, carrying his elderly father on his back and leading his young son by the hand. Aeneas's voyage in exile eventually brought him to Italy, as told in Virgil's Aeneid. There he became an ancestor of the Romans, linking Rome's origins to Troy's legacy. Meanwhile, the victorious Greeks faced their own sorrows. Many Greek heroes never saw home. Achilles' death came before Troy's fall. Ajax the Great perished tragically, and Agamemnon was infamously murdered upon returning to Mycenae. Only Odysseus's long wanderings, described in Homer's Odyssey, rival the fall of Troy as a tale of post-war suffering. Thus, the Trojan War's aftermath was bitter for victors and vanquished alike, befitting a conflict ignited by pride and passion. This legend of Troy's fall, with its giant horse and burning city, resonated through the ages. Centuries later, people used the term Trojan horse as a byword for deceptive tricks, an expression still common today. Yet it is important to note that these events are part of mythic tradition, not documented history. Homer's Iliad itself covers only a few weeks of the war, ending before Troy falls, and the famous horse story is absent from the Iliad. Instead, it was pieced together from various ancient sources. How much of this gripping saga actually happened? The ancient Greeks believed quite a lot of it was true, but modern scholars have had to weigh myth versus reality, as we shall see. For the ancient Greeks, the Trojan War was not a mere legend. It was believed to be an actual historical event, a defining moment in their distant past. Greek historians dated the war to roughly the 13th or 12th century BC, around 400 years before Homer's time. Herodotus, the 5th century BC historian often called the father of history, treated the Trojan War as a real occurrence and placed it about 800 years before his own era, which would be in the Bronze Age. The war and its heroes were woven into Greek cultural identity. For example, cities claimed to house relics of the Trojan War, and heroes' tombs, like Achilles' mound, were revered sites on the Trojan plain. The legacy of Troy grew even more influential in the Roman world. The Romans, eager to insert themselves into the heroic age, claimed descent from the Trojan survivors. In Virgil's epic poem the Aeneid, written in the 1st century BC, the Trojan prince Aeneas is cast as the forefather of the Romans. Julius Caesar, and especially the first emperor Augustus, liked to trace their lineage back to Aeneas and the goddess Venus, linking Rome's imperial destiny to Troy's noble bloodline. This adoption of Trojan ancestry by the Romans illustrates how fully the Trojan War was accepted as history in antiquity. To the Roman mind, Troy's fall was an event that eventually gave rise to Rome itself, a powerful political and cultural narrative. Because of this revered status, the physical site of Troy became a place of pilgrimage and homage in classical times. By the 7th century BC, Greek settlers in the Troad, the region of Troy, identified a ruined hill, Hisarlık, as the location of ancient Troy. The old city's name lived on as Ilion, or Ilium. A tradition arose that the Greek state of Locris had to atone for one of its ancestors' impieties during the war. The Locrians sent 2 young women to serve as priestesses at the Trojan sanctuary of Athena each year, as penance for the hero Ajax having violated King Priam's daughter Cassandra in Athena's temple during the sack. Incredibly, this ritual tribute of the Locrian maidens at Troy continued for centuries, right into the Hellenistic period. Such practices show how vivid the memory of Troy remained in the Greek world. The ruins of Troy, Ilium, benefited from patronage by the powerful. In 334 BC, Alexander the Great detoured to visit the site of Troy on his way to conquer Persia. The young conqueror paid homage at the supposed tomb of Achilles and sacrificed to Athena, consciously modeling himself as a new hero in the mold of the Trojan War legends. Later, Hellenistic kings built a magnificent temple of Athena on the Acropolis of Troy in the 3rd century BC, and the city of Ilion was revived as a small but symbolically important town. Under Roman rule, the city, now called Ilium, was favored by emperors who prided themselves on Trojan ancestry. Even Emperor Hadrian visited. In myth, Trojan heroes became ancestral figures for Rome, and in reality Roman benefactors gave Troy special status. Julius Caesar, after his victory in a key battle, reportedly proclaimed he would rebuild Troy as a great city, though this plan never materialized. The Roman general Sulla granted Ilium privileges in the 1st century BC, and later emperors such as Augustus funded its restoration. Troy/Ilium thus enjoyed a kind of second life as a living monument of the past, a place where history and myth blended in the eyes of ancient visitors. By the late antiquity period, however, Troy's fortunes waned. A devastating earthquake in the 6th century AD finally led to the abandonment of Ilium. Without continuous habitation, the location of Troy eventually faded from common knowledge. During the Middle Ages, Europeans knew of the Trojan War story, often through retellings like Geoffrey of Monmouth's and medieval romances, but they often relocated Troy in their imagination. Some legends even placed Trojan descendants in far-off lands, fueling fanciful genealogies of European peoples. The actual site of Troy lay silent, its ruins buried and its identity half forgotten, until curiosity and scholarship revived in the modern era. By the 19th century, scholars and adventurers were determined to pinpoint the real Troy, if it indeed existed. Clues from ancient texts suggested Troy was in the northwest corner of modern Turkey, in the region historically called the Troad. A few early pioneers like Charles MacLaren, a Scotsman, and Frank Calvert, an English expatriate in the Ottoman Empire, surveyed mounds in the Troad and suspected a hill called Hisarlık held the remains of Troy. Hisarlık was a prominent mound overlooking the plain of the Scamander River near the Dardanelles Strait, a location that roughly fit Homer's geographical hints. Calvert conducted small test digs and was convinced enough to inform others that Hisarlık was the likely Troy. The breakthrough came with a colorful figure, Heinrich Schliemann, a German businessman turned amateur archaeologist. Inspired by Homer's epics and convinced the Trojan War had a basis in fact, Schliemann arrived at Hisarlık in 1870 to excavate the legendary city. With boundless determination and financed by the fortune he had made in trade, Schliemann hired local laborers and literally began cutting deep into the mound. In 1873, he famously carved a great trench through the hill, a crude method that, while destructive, revealed that Hisarlık was composed of layered ruins, a stratified tell containing multiple ancient cities built one atop another. In other words, Schliemann confirmed what Calvert suspected. This hill was an archaeological time capsule preserving many phases of settlement. Schliemann soon uncovered massive stone walls and the remains of large buildings. Ecstatic, he declared he had found Troy. In fact, he believed a particular layer, which he called Troy II, with its impressive fortifications and a cache of golden treasure, was Homer's Troy. In a dramatic flourish, Schliemann announced he had discovered Priam's treasure, a hoard of gold jewelry, cups, and weapons, which he spirited away, illicitly, from Turkish authorities. He even photographed his wife wearing the ancient gold headdress. However, Schliemann's enthusiasm outpaced his archaeological caution. It turned out the gold treasure and grand buildings belonged to a city more than 1,000 years older than the time of the Trojan War. He had dug too deep. The layer he identified as Homeric Troy, Troy II, circa 2500 BC, was from the early Bronze Age, not the late Bronze Age of Homer's story. In the process of reaching it, Schliemann also plowed through later layers of the mound, causing irreparable damage to artifacts and contexts from Troy's true Trojan War era levels. His excavations were a double-edged sword. They proved that a great ancient city had indeed existed at Hisarlık, convincing the world that the Trojan War city was real. But his rough methods nearly obliterated critical evidence and later earned severe criticism from archaeologists. Despite the destruction, Schliemann's work was a landmark in archaeology. Following Schliemann, more systematic excavations were undertaken. His colleague Wilhelm Dörpfeld continued digging in the 1890s and identified a later layer, which came to be called Troy VI, as a better candidate for Homeric Troy, due to its later date and impressive walls. In the 1930s, American archaeologist Carl Blegan of the University of Cincinnati carried out meticulous excavations. Blegan confirmed the site's multi-layered nature and focused on a level he named Troy 7A, a subdivision of the seventh layer, which showed clear evidence of violent destruction around 1200 BC, tantalizingly close to the traditional date of the Trojan War. Each of these archaeologists added pieces to the puzzle of Troy's timeline. By the mid-20th century, scholars broadly agreed that the mound of Hisarlık contained the ruins of the historical city that inspired the legend, even if pinning down the exact war and layer was still debated. In 1988, excavations resumed under Manfred Korfmann of the University of Tübingen, later joined by teams from the University of Cincinnati, led by C. Brian Rose. These modern archaeological projects brought new technology and perspectives. Geophysical surveys and digging around the base of the mound revealed a surprise. Troy was far larger than previously thought. Earlier excavators had concentrated on the citadel, the high part of the mound, But Korfmann's team discovered evidence of a sprawling lower town south of the citadel. They found traces of houses, workshops, and a defensive system beyond the citadel walls. Notably, a large rock-cut ditch encircled the lower town, likely serving as an outer defense. This ditch, several meters wide and deep, might have been meant to thwart chariots or invaders approaching the city. The realization that a substantial lower city, around 15 times larger area than the citadel, existed during Troy's late Bronze Age height dramatically changed the understanding of Troy. It went from being thought of as a small, perhaps insignificant fortress to a major city with a large population. Indeed, a worthy prize to fight over. These newer excavations also employed rigorous stratigraphic recording, preserving the contexts that Schliemann's methods had sometimes destroyed. By the 21st century, Troy had become one of the best-studied archaeological sites in Anatolia, and it was recognized not just as myth, but as a real place of historical importance. In 1998, the archaeological site of Troy was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, underscoring its value to World Heritage. One of the most fascinating aspects of Troy is that it is not one city, but many layered atop each other. Archaeologists differentiate these layers with Roman numerals 1 through 9. Each Troy represents a settlement phase, from the early Bronze Age to the Byzantine era, all at the same mound of Hisarlık. This continual rebuilding is why Troy became such a rich palimpsest of history, and also why the legends of a city destroyed and rebuilt have such archaeological resonance. Troy Y, circa 3000 to 2550 BC. The earliest city on the site was a small fortified settlement in the early Bronze Age. It was perched on the hill and already had massive limestone fortification walls for its time. This indicates that from its beginning, Troy's position had strategic value requiring defense. Troy I was destroyed by fire around 2550 BC. Troy II, circa 2500 to 2300 BC. After Troy II's destruction, a new city, Troy II, rose, larger and richer. Troy II had impressive mud brick and stone walls, and a citadel with monumental gates and large Megaron-style buildings, halls. Schliemann's Priam's treasure came from this layer, highlighting the wealth of Troy II. This city ended in a fiery destruction as well, possibly part of a wider collapse of early Bronze Age sites, though whether by attack or accident is unclear. Schliemann mistakenly believed Troy II's grand ruins were those of Homeric Troy, but later research showed Troy II was a full millennium too early to be the Trojan War city. Troy III, IV, V, circa 2300 to 1750 BC. These layers represent the Middle Bronze Age, a period of rebuilding on a smaller scale after Troy II's fall. They appear to have been less wealthy or perhaps less thoroughly uncovered, partly because Schliemann's deep trench obliterated much of Troy 3 to 5 levels. What evidence remains suggests these were smaller towns that did not reach Troy II's heights of prosperity. Nevertheless, Troy's location continued to be occupied, indicating a resilience or persistent importance of the site. Troy VI, circa 1750 to 1300 BC. This is where Troy regains its glory. Troy VI corresponds to the late Bronze Age city that many suspect could be the Homeric Troy. During this era, Troy, likely called Wilusa in contemporary Hittite records, was a significant fortified city and regional hub. Archaeology shows that Troy VI had mighty stone walls sloping inward, a style called ashlar masonry, towers overlooking the plain, and multiple gates. Inside the citadel, large multi-room houses on terraces suggest a high-ranking elite lived there. There is evidence of Aegean influence in some architecture, like Megaron buildings, and pottery, indicating contact or trade with Mycenaean Greece. Meanwhile, local culture was distinctively Anatolian as well. Possibly the people of Troy VI were Luwian-speaking Anatolians with ties to the Hittite Empire. Troy VI's lower town, as noted, extended far beyond the citadel, protected by a ditch and perhaps a palisade. This phase of the city was prosperous, engaged in regional trade, including evidence of horse breeding and textile production in the surrounding plains. It controlled the approaches to the Dardanelles Strait, a crucial choke point for trade between the Aegean and Black Sea. Troy 6 met a sudden end around 1300 BC. Archaeologists found that its walls and buildings suffered heavy damage from what looks like an earthquake. Walls cracked and boulders shifted, with no signs of massive fire or war in that destruction horizon. It appears a powerful quake leveled much of the city. Troy sits on a seismic fault zone. The Trojans did rebuild, however, leading into the next phase. Troy 7a, circa 1300 to 1180 BC. Following the earthquake, Troy's inhabitants, or new arrivals, resettled amid the ruins. This sublayer is essentially a continuation of Troy 6's people and culture, but now the archaeological remains tell a tale of a city on guard. Many of the grand houses were replaced by cramped buildings and long defensive walls subdividing the citadel, suggesting the population crowded inside the fortress for safety. Large storage jars, pithoi, were buried in house floors, perhaps to stockpile food in case of siege. Clearly, security became a priority in Troy 7a. This period is exactly when ancient Greek tradition places the Trojan War, the late 13th to early 12th century BC. Indeed, Troy 7a ends in a dramatic destruction that archaeologists have linked to warfare. The destruction layer, dated roughly 1180 BC, is littered with evidence of a violent sack. Charred debris nearly 1.5 meters thick in places, carbonized timbers, scattered skeletons of people who did not get proper burial, bronze arrowheads and spear tips, and even piles of sling stones stockpiled by the defenders that were left unused when the city fell. Unlike the previous destruction, this one was accompanied by widespread burning and unquestionably suggests an enemy attack and conflagration. It is hard not to see in this layer a convincing candidate for the historical kernel of the Trojan War myth. Someone, whether Mycenaean Greeks or another foe, stormed Troy 7a and burned it to the ground in the late Bronze Age. The coincidence with the legendary date of the Trojan War is striking. While we cannot recover the names of the combatants from archaeology alone, the physical evidence of war at Troy's layer 7a is compelling. Troy 7b, circa 1180 to 950 BC. After that cataclysm, the site was not completely abandoned. Some remnant of the population, or new settlers from elsewhere, tried to continue life amid the rubble. Troy 7b is subdivided, 7b1, 7b2, etc., and shows a series of smaller rebuildings. The material culture shifted. Pottery styles suggest newcomers possibly from the Balkans or Northwest, perhaps refugees or invaders in the upheavals of the age. These post-war Trojans still inhabited the shadow of the old citadel, even reusing some of its ruins for cult rituals, indicating a cultural memory of the past. However, life was now modest. Troy had been greatly reduced in regional importance. Troy 7b appears to have suffered at least one more destruction by fire around 950 BC, after which there is scant evidence of habitation. Indeed, after around 950 BC, it seems Troy became almost deserted for a time. This corresponds to the early Iron Age Dark Age in the Aegean and Anatolia, when many former Bronze Age sites were at low ebb. Troy 8, circa 700 to 85 BC. Centuries later, during the Archaic and Classical Greek period, Troy rises again. In the late 8th or 7th century BC, during a wave of Greek colonization, settlers, probably from the island of Lesbos or mainland Greece, resettled Hisarlık. A new city, Ilium, was founded, deliberately connecting itself to the famous Trojan War site. By now, the ruins of the Bronze Age citadel, segments of those sloping stone walls, were still visible and likely venerated. The Greek Ilium never grew very large, but it had its own acropolis and temples. A fine temple of Athena was erected in the 3rd century BC on the site, as mentioned earlier, and later dedicated by the kings of Pergamon. Troy 8 fell under the sway of various Hellenistic kingdoms, Persian Empire briefly, then Alexander's generals, then Pergamon. It was sometimes caught up in wars of those eras, but also enjoyed patronage due to its legendary status. In 85 BC, during the Mithridatic Wars, the Roman general Fimbria sacked Ilium for supporting his rival Sulla, but Sulla later helped rebuild it in recompense. Troy 9, 85 BC circa, a d. 500. This is the Roman city of Ilium. After becoming part of the Roman Republic and then Empire, Troy Ilium was refounded yet again and enjoyed imperial favor. Roman Ilium was a modest provincial city, but benefited from its glorious mythic pedigree. Roman patrons constructed a theater, baths, and public squares at the site. Emperor Augustus, according to some sources, visited or at least supported the city, aligning with his Trojan ancestry propaganda. The city persisted through the Roman Empire, experiencing a last flourish of building in the 2nd century AD. By the 4th and 5th centuries, Ilium declined as political focus shifted and earthquakes struck. Finally, as noted, a major quake in the 6th century AD likely dealt the final blow. Troy then quietly became ruins and gradually grass-covered mound, awaiting rediscovery. This sequence of 9 cities built on the same spot gave credence to later legends that Troy was the city that will not die, always rising again. It also meant that for anyone digging at Hisarlık, the Homeric-era remains were buried under many meters of later debris. This complexity initially confounded Schliemann, who expected one Troy but found a stack of Troys. Now, however, archaeologists can read this layered record as a detailed timeline of the site's life. Importantly, at least 2 layers show evidence of cataclysmic destruction. One around 1300 BC, Troy 6 earthquake, and one around 1180 BC, Troy 7 as fiery sack. These would have made a deep impression on survivors and could correspond to multiple Trojan War memories. Was there a real Trojan War? This question has intrigued scholars for centuries. Modern evidence suggests that while the Trojan War of legend, with its 10-year duration, heroes like Achilles, and meddling gods, is a product of myth and poetic license, it likely contains a kernel of historical truth. The archaeology of Troy and its region, combined with Hittite and Mycenaean records, paints a picture of a city that indeed was caught up in violent conflicts around the traditional time of the war. First, consider Troy's strategic location. Troy sat near the entrance of the Dardanelles, ancient Hellespont, controlling the maritime gateway between the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea. Any power holding Troy could tax or block the lucrative trade flowing through this narrow choke point. As archaeologist C. Brian Rose quipped, "We speak of one Trojan War, but in fact many wars were fought at Troy over the millennia, including even a World War I battle, Gallipoli in 1915, across the strait. In essence, Troy's position made it a coveted stronghold. Conflicts over Troy were likely motivated by economics and power, rather than just the romantic narrative of an abducted queen. The mythic cause, Helen, may be a symbolic stand-in for the real casus belli, control of trade routes, territorial expansion, or political dominance. Now, the archaeological evidence of conflict at Troy is compelling, especially for the Troy 7 layer, circa 1200 BC. As described, that destruction layer includes arrowheads, spear points, and signs of intense fire. Human remains found in the debris imply people died violent deaths and were left unburied, consistent with a city taken by enemies. Defensive measures like stored sling stones and hurriedly built walls suggest the inhabitants anticipated trouble. This aligns well with a wartime scenario. While archaeology can't name the combatants, the timeline fits the era when the Mycenaean Greek civilization was at its zenith and expanding its influence overseas. We also know that around 1180 BC, nearly every major palace or city in the eastern Mediterranean was destroyed or abandoned. This period is known as the Bronze Age collapse. Mycenaean fortresses in Greece, the Hittite capital Hattusa in Anatolia, cities in the Levant all fell in the same general period as Troy 7a. The causes of this widespread collapse were complex, likely a combination of warfare, perhaps by marauding groups like the Sea Peoples, internal rebellions, earthquakes, and famine. Troy's destruction could have been one theater in this larger regional upheaval. If Mycenaean Greeks were indeed responsible for sacking Troy, it might have been one of their final campaigns before their own civilization fell apart. As one historian noted, the attack on Troy might have been one of the last strikes before Mycenaean Greece itself succumbed to destruction. Hittite records bolster the case that Wilusa, Troy, was involved in conflict with foreign powers, quite possibly the Achaeans Greeks. Tablets from the Hittite archives refer to a kingdom called Wilusa in northwestern Anatolia, which linguistic analysis strongly identifies with Ilios/Ilion, Troy. These records show that Wilusa was at times a vassal to the Hittite Empire, but also that it could become a pawn or victim in wars. One Hittite letter, the Manapa-Tarhunta letter, describes turmoil involving a renegade warlord, likely Piamaradu, in western Anatolia, and hints at Wilusa's king being deposed. Another text, the Milawata letter, indicates a Hittite king had to reinstall a loyal ruler in Wilusa, a king named Walmu, after some uprising. Most intriguingly, a treaty from around 1280 BC between the Hittite king Muwatalli II and a Wilusan king named Alexander, has survived. The name Alexandru is strikingly similar to Paris's other name in Greek legend, Alexandros. While we should not jump to equate this Wilusan king with the Trojan prince of myth, it at least shows that a person named Alexander/Alexandru ruled Troy, Wilusa, at one point, and he had dealings with powerful neighbors. Furthermore, Hittite documents mention a people called Ahiawa, which scholars generally interpret as the Hittite name for the Mycenaean Greeks, Achaeans. One Hittite letter even describes a conflict or dispute involving Ahiawa over Wilusa, essentially implying that Mycenaean Greeks and the Hittites were competing over influence in Troy's region. This could be a veiled reference to some military action, though the details are scant. Taken together, these Hittite sources tantalizingly suggest a backdrop for a Trojan War, a valuable city, Wilusa, Troy, caught between two great powers, Mycenaean Greece and Hittite Anatolia, experiencing political upheaval and perhaps occasional battles for its control. It's not proof of the Homeric War, but it shows the myths did not arise from a vacuum. The late Bronze Age world was interconnected and conflict-ridden, making a war at Troy plausible. Another piece of evidence comes from the Greek side, clay tablets from the Mycenaean palace of Pylos in southwest Greece, written in Linear B script. One tablet records a list of captive women from Asia, Anatolia, working as slaves in Pylos, presumably taken in raids. This indicates that Mycenaean Greeks were indeed engaged in raiding or warfare across the Aegean into Anatolia, capturing people and bringing them back. It's not hard to imagine that a rich city like Troy would attract similar raids. While there's no direct mention of Helen in any tablets, the idea of women being war prizes, as Helen was in the myth, has a chilling echo in these records. Indeed, in Homer's Iliad, both sides capture women. Achilles takes Briseis, Agamemnon takes Chryseis, etc., reflecting the real Bronze Age practice of treating women as war booty. So the social realities, raiding, slave-taking, alliance warfare, behind the Trojan War story align with what we know of that era. What about the famous Trojan horse? Archaeology has found no giant wooden horse buried at Troy, and realistically we wouldn't expect to, as the wooden structure would have rotted away if it ever existed. Most scholars believe the Trojan horse tale is pure legend, a metaphor for trickery. Some have speculated it might encode a historical kernel, possibly a siege engine or battering ram decorated with a horse's head that the Greeks used, or perhaps the horse was a poetic symbol for an earthquake, since Poseidon, god of earthquakes, was also god of horses, and a quake did breach Troy's walls once. But these remain conjectures. The simplest explanation is that the horse was an invention of storytellers to provide a clever and memorable climax to the war. As archaeologist C. Brian Rose dryly notes, there is no evidence that a colossal horse with hollow interior played any role in the attack on Troy 7a. It was the Greeks' creative way to explain how such a strong city could be taken, through cunning rather than brute force. In summary, a balanced view from evidence is Troy was real, and it was destroyed violently around 1180 BC, very likely by human attackers. Those attackers could well have been Mycenaean Greeks or their allies, as the legend states, though definitive proof is elusive. The scale of the conflict, however, might have been much smaller than the grand coalition of thousands described in the Iliad. It could have been a more local affair, or one of several conflicts over Troy. The 10-year duration might be poetic exaggeration. Prolonged sieges were known in antiquity, but a decade is long. It's possible that later bards magnified a relatively modest war into an epic saga, adding heroic embellishments and divine interventions. As one historian put it, archaeological finds in Turkey suggest that the city of Troy did exist, but a conflict on the immense scale of a 10-year siege may not have actually occurred in exactly that way. The consensus among many scholars is that the Trojan War legend is a fusion of various historical elements, memories of multiple sieges or attacks on Troy, oral tales of warrior heroes passed down through generations, and storytelling genius that wove them into one coherent narrative. The myth preserves truths about the Bronze Age, such as the existence of powerful cities, raiding across the Aegean, and the tragic destruction that ended that era, but it wraps them in fiction when it comes to personalities and supernatural events. Our knowledge of Troy and the Trojan War comes at us from two directions: literature and archaeology. On one hand, Homer's Iliad and other epic cycle poems provide a rich narrative of the war, but composed centuries after the fact, around the 8th century BC, based on oral traditions. On the other hand, modern digs give us hard evidence of a city's rise and fall. Bridging these two is the work of historians, classicists, and archaeologists over the past 2 centuries. Each new find can either corroborate or challenge the age-old story. Not long ago, many scholars were highly skeptical that the Trojan War ever happened at all. In the early 19th century, Troy was widely thought to be purely mythical. Today, however, few would claim Troy never existed. Schliemann and his successors settled that debate by locating a great city where legend placed it. The focus has shifted to how the myth relates to reality. Modern interpretations vary. Some scholars argue the legend is loosely based on an actual war, or wars, that occurred at the end of the Bronze Age, while others caution that we may never be able to tie Homer's story to specific events. As Trevor Bryce, a noted Hittite expert, remarked, "The less hard evidence we have, the easier it is to bend it to fit whichever version of the Trojan War we want, a reminder to avoid jumping to unwarranted conclusions." Yet a middle ground view has emerged as the most plausible. Troy was a real city that was important enough to fight over. Something significant, a destructive war or siege, did happen to it around 1180 BC, and this event left such a memory in the region that bards centuries later still sang of it, though embellishing freely. The longevity of the oral tradition is remarkable. For perhaps 400 to 500 years after the fall of Troy 7a, minstrels in Greek lands recited tales of Achilles, Hector, and the fall of Troy, until eventually those tales were crystallized in the epic poems we have. In that process, fact and fiction intertwined. Homer's Iliad is not a historical record, but it likely incorporates realistic details of Bronze Age warfare, like boar's tusk helmets, bronze weapons, chariot fighting, all of which archaeology confirms were present. At the same time, Homer mixes in elements from his own later era and creative inventions. For example, the Iliad mentions iron weapons occasionally, even though the war was in the Bronze Age, a small anachronism from Homer's time. He also focuses on the human drama and the interference of gods, which reflect literary and religious culture more than literal history. In modern times, interest in Troy has never waned. In fact, it has flourished. The tale has inspired countless adaptations, from stage plays in ancient Athens to Hollywood films and television today. The allure lies in its timeless themes: love and betrayal, honor and hubris, war's glory and suffering, the interplay of fate and free will. The story of Troy has proven so enduring that new angles keep emerging. Recent novels retell the war from Trojan perspectives or women's perspectives. Archaeologists continuously publish new findings from the site, and scientists analyze everything from the climate conditions of late Bronze Age Troy to the composition of metals in arrowheads found there. Even in the world of technology, as a cultural nod, we name malicious computer programs Trojan horses as a metaphor for deceptive infiltration, a direct homage to the ancient ruse that felled a city. Significantly, Troy has also become a symbol of the meeting point between myth and science. Each summer that excavations continue, we get a clearer image of what Troy was really like, its layout, its trade, its daily life, and how it changed over time. Scholars compare Homer's descriptions to the archaeological data. For instance, Homer describes windy Ilion, with broad streets and strong gates, and indeed Troy 6 had strong gate complexes and was exposed to sea breezes on a hill. He speaks of Trojan allies from far lands, which matches the Hittite texts listing Troy's regional context. These correspondences show that the bard preserved a memory of the late Bronze Age setting, even if filtered through later understanding. Modern geological studies have even reconstructed the Trojan plain. In Homer's day, the coastline was closer to the city, and a shallow bay or lagoon existed where now there is farmland. This helps explain parts of the Iliad, like the Greek ships being drawn up on shore. The shore was nearer Troy then than now. Such interdisciplinary research, combining literature, archaeology, geology, and even DNA analysis of ancient remains, continues to enhance our knowledge of Troy. In the end, what can we confidently say about Troy? We can say Troy was not just a myth, it was a real city, and the ruins at Hisarlık are its remains. We can say that around 1200 BC, a violent event befell Troy, and that this aligns with Greek legends of a war. We can also say the story of Troy did not end in the Bronze Age. Troy lived on in the imagination, shaping identities and inspiring art and culture from antiquity to now. As the World Heritage Inscription notes, Troy's archaeological site inherently represents the overlap of myth and reality. It embodies a legendary narrative known worldwide, and at the same time, it holds the tangible evidence of 4,000 years of human history. The saga of Troy teaches us how history can be remembered and transformed into epic, and how a poem can lead a man with a shovel to uncover an ancient city. Whether Achilles and Hector ever truly fought on the plains of Ilios, the world will always remember Troy, the city of poets' dreams and archaeologists' digs, as a place where legend and fact entwine inextricably. In Troy, myth meets history, and that is why it captivates us to this day. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more fascinating stories, and ring the bell so you never miss a new episode from Cipher History. Stay curious.